June 19th, 2014. Guys, I got a lot of questions about the solar flares that we had last week, just one after the other, and the effects on the Earth. And we talked about, since we weren't seeing the large quakes, remember, volcanoes, the surface of the Earth heating up, the inside of the Earth heating up with magma flows, things like that. That image right there this is a current from satellites. Those are glacial ponds, sometimes kilometers wide. And what they do is eat into that surface and cause cracks, and they cause flooding as this builds up. On the left was yesterday, the 17th, June 2014, 40% of surface melt occurred on the 17th. 40% of the surface melted. Now, you can see in this graph, it says yesterday 40% of the surface of Greenland melted. It was still mid-June, yet a month before melt values typically peak. But a persistent high-pressure system over Greenland, a rapidly melting Baffin Bay, and warm winds riding up the west coast were enough to spur a surface melting event that shoved melt coverage firmly above the 2 standard deviation thresholds and into record range. This Arctic vortex spinning up there is picking up that heat. It says temperatures along the west coast of Greenland and on through the southern ice-covered tip range between 30 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. That's warm. It says it caused warm winds and rain with mixed precipitation, with a moisture-laden storm coming out of Baffin Bay, and it's got these big, what they're called these melt ponds, up to 3 kilometers wide. It says these melt ponds will be further swelled by a combination of warm and wet weather. And now this picture was yesterday on June 18th, and it's showing some of this. We've looked at it. It says it's the largest of these ponds are 3 kilometers at the widest point. This Lance Modus satellite images, guys. But that's the Jacobshaven Glacier. They're saying now that this glacier is it's Greenland's fastest moving. It is now involved in a very rapid rush towards the ocean at a rate of 46 meters a day. A rush that has been facilitated in recent years by major proliferation of melt ponds during summertime. During extreme events, melt ponds can combine and overtop or break ice dams and dangerous glacial outburst flood. This goes on to say that 40% melt coverage in mid-June is an extraordinarily high number. Last year, melt coverage peaked at 40% in late July, with June values approaching 20%. That's half. July of 2012 saw a 97% melt coverage, an event last seen about 120 years ago. It's telling you what these last 3 years have been doing. Now this year we're having this solar max, so don't let that pass by. They're saying a lot of this is human caused global warming, and we do have some of that, but nothing man can do can compare to that sun heating up the way it's doing. Again, this is from the satellites, but it's a close-up of one of those glacial ponds, and they should be called glacial lakes. Some of these things are huge, and you can see as you're breaking and dividing and separating, you're creating these large ice flows, large melts. And when we're talking about this much ice, you always have to wonder about sea levels rising, guys. But again, this is a large melt lake in Greenland, and these things run to the oceans that break. But let's look at this summer. It said it's been yet one more summer of anomalous weather events resulting from human-caused warming. Guys, don't believe everything. Massive floods have spanned the globe, shattering records that have stood for 50, 100, or even 500 years. In other regions, record droughts and heat waves have resulted in thousands of heat injuries and hundreds of deaths, while the Southeast Asian heat dome alone reported to have hospitalized tens of thousands, and it resulted in at least 100 deaths in China, Japan, and Korea. These droughts and heat waves created hazardous water shortages, putting communities from the American Southwest to eastern China at risk of severe damage and loss of ability to supply growing water demands. We've seen that. And guys, remember last year, a year ago last year, I think it was, about the big flood that was in the Himalayas. It said it set off a freakish flood in the Himalayan highlands. Flood set off by a combination of high altitude rainfall and the collapse of dams formed around growing glacial melt lakes in a region undergoing very rapid melt and warming. The higher up in the Himalayas, guys, that they're seeing this, it's getting very much warmer. The higher their altitude, the hotter. Now, that's unusual in itself, but this solar heat, it says one such melt lake developed and filled over the past years in a region just 4 kilometers to the north of the Indian village of Kurtanath. And guys, you remember that last year we did a video on it. But the same thing happened. Heating in the Himalayas caused these big ponds to fill up and then break. But the immense flood swept away more than 6,000 people who are now presumed dead after one of the worst floods events in history. And we know God does not like these idols. Never has. But this is global. We're just looking at the Himalayas as this flooded down and into these villages here. But there are things that are happening on this globe right now that God is trying to get our attention. Now, they've been noticing this over the last few years, and listen, a recent report published in Nature found that just another 0.8 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature would be enough to push the Greenland ice sheet to the point of no return. Guys, I bet you this is what happened in that last great ice age, because they found woolly mammoths with flowers in their mouth. In other words, it was a flash freeze. As some of these great dams broke, they can travel thousands of miles. They're saying the problem with the Greenland melt, however, is in many ways far worse than the melt of the massive, though comparatively smaller, Himalayan glaciers. The Greenland ice sheet is entirely contiguous and has massive depth and towering elevation of 2 miles in its center. Glacial outburst floods events from such a large source will therefore be far more catastrophic. In the Greenland melt dynamic, multiple glacial melts lakes will increasingly form over the surface of the Greenland ice sheet. We can already see such events beginning during current summers. The above shot, which we saw provided by NASA, showed numerous melt lakes forming in the western border of the Greenland ice sheet on August 4, 2013, last year. These melt lakes are many times larger than those seen in the Himalayas, with some of them reaching 6 kilometers in length. In the future, we can expect the size and number of the glacial melt lakes to greatly increase, and they are this year, guys. And when that happens, you have these great damming effects, large terraces coming from 2 miles in elevation, thousands of miles wide, melting and collapsing. And that's what they're concerned about. We know it happened once before. And guys, a lot of North America was covered in ice at one time, very deep in ice. It says with such a large region of ice covered by numerous melt lakes, a kind of ominous tipping point may be reached. During warm summer months, weather systems may pull warmth and moisture over a large section of the Greenland ice sheet, which is already covered with numerous melt ponds. It says eventually some of these melt lakes begin to overtop, spilling water into the already filled lakes lower down on the ice sheet. These lakes also overtop, contributing to even greater volumes of water flowing. It says depending on how far melt lakes penetrate into the ice sheet, this chain reaction overtopping can proceed for tens or even hundreds of kilometers. By the time the massive flood has reached the lower ice sheet edge, perhaps a kilometer or more below the initial flood source, a massive glacial originating wave has developed, one that is perhaps tens or hundreds of feet in height and with a front covering tens or even hundreds of miles. Such a powerful outburst megaflood would contain both freezing water, large fragments of ice ripped from the ice sheet as the outburst wave proceeded down the ice sheet. That's how those woolly mammoths got trapped, guys. This is what they're talking about. These are satellite images. It looks small, but this is very large. Look at the size of these cliffs and these lakes as they start to cascade down this terrace, and that's what they're talking about. It's built up 2 miles high. So you can imagine the effect: tidal surge, floods, and debris in the floods. They say we see evidence of such events occurring at the end of the last ice age, with petrified trees embedded in rock strata up to 500 feet above sea level in the cliffs and mountainsides of Pacific islands bordering the Arctic. It is thought that the trees were carried by massive glacial outburst floods from the melted Laurentide ice sheet, which at the end of the last ice age was thousands of miles away from this tree deposition. The trees found in these deposits are native to Canada and Alaska, and the character of their Deposition is indicative of a catastrophic outburst flood event or series of events. It says glacial outburst megafloods are among the most dangerous risks posed by rapid Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheet melting, warming, and destabilization, and Greenland is most likely to see its first manifestations, though Antarctica may follow soon afterward over the course of years or decades. It's happening pretty fast. Such ice sheet decline will be both chaotic and destructive, with moments of almost unthinkable outburst events proceeding over certain tipping points are reached. Some of these events may already be locked in due to current human forcing and related natural feedback. Let us hope that it is possible to prevent their very worst manifestations. Guys, we'll see about that. We're very close to the end times, and we're in solar max again. The last few days have been quiet, but again, when we watch the sun the way we do, guys, there's a lot of reasons, and now we're starting to see all of this come together. It's a heads up. We're watching it. Be safe.